Anybody want to admit they've been to a tractor pull? If you just like to smell gasoline and nitrous and listen to loud things, there's nothing more primitive than a good old tractor pull. Lots of motors. If you want to talk about motor systems, lots of motors to look at in tractor pulls. Nothing more primitive than that. So, I will be handing out this little chart here. I noticed that the chart I had printed out today didn't have one of the tracks on it, so I'm gonna. But you guys have this available too. You can print it off from a slide if you want. So just like we had kind of this overview of the somatosensory system, we have this nice little overview of what we're going to be covering in today's talk. So we have the motor system. We have different areas of our nervous system that are involved with that. We have the cerebral cortex. This is for the voluntary part of our motor system. Our cerebral cortex is really important for that. We have a couple regions up there in our cerebral cortex that are important for that. The primary motor cortex, the pre and the supplementary motor cortices. We have what's called control circuits, and these are the things we'll be talking about next week, which are primarily the basal ganglia and cerebellum that help to shape motor output but don't have actual direct connections to our muscles or the lower motor neurons that go to our muscles, but they influence the overall motor system and are just as critical for motor output. But we're going to be focusing today on primarily the descending motor pathways. So these are the pathways that are coming down from our cerebral cortex and from our brainstem that go down to tell the lower motor neurons, the alpha motor neurons, what to do. And they also tell the gamma motor neurons too that innervate the muscle spindles. And you can see the various tracks that I have listed there. Do most of you, I was talking to some of you yesterday, most of you have like the 4th or 5th edition of the current Lundy-Ekman textbook. Does anybody have the 3rd edition currently? Or are we all at the 4th edition level pretty much? So, okay, well, that helps me for understanding where we're at with things. So, but then you also have your other textbook, which is the more kind of neuroanatomical focused textbook, the Crossman book, which really kind of is more, succinct, and I like that book for kind of really getting you to the heart of it. When you look at those chapters on the motor system in those two books, you're going to see some discrepancies in terminology used to describe some of those descending tracks or motor pathways. But I do think, and I'm going to share with you some motor pathways that are not in your Lundy-Ekman book, or used to be, but are no longer in there. So let me clarify, so as you do your reading, you don't get too confused. So there's a couple tracks that originate from the brainstem that in your 4th edition of Lundy-Ekman, they collectively just call them the reticulospinal tracks. Okay. Those they call it the reticulospinal, I think they just call it the reticulospinal tract. But it's not necessarily one individual tract. Okay, it's actually several different tracks. And so in your Crossman book, it does describe these individual tracks. So those are this one here, the tectospinal tract, the pontine reticulospinal tract, and the medullary reticulospinal tract. So these 3 items right here collectively in your Lundy-Ekman book referred to as the reticulospinal tracts. Okay, so those 3, they talk about them as a group, and they talk about the function of those, the collective function. We are going to show you those individually, talk about what they do a little bit more nuanced. However, for the exam, I'm going to go back and look at the exam, see if I ask specifically. I do expect you to know what those tracks are, know that they're all reticulospinal tracts, but probably you'll need to know a little bit more collectively about what they do versus you're not going to have to know the individual, every connection of those tracks. You probably want to know where they start and stop, but the names tell you where they start and stop. which is nice, similar to some of the sensory pathways, tells you, and we'll break it down for you when we get to those. But I just want you to kind of understand where we're coming from before we get there, so you don't get, whoa, what are you talking about, this tectospinal tract? Never heard of that thing. Well, it is actually in your Crossman book if you haven't read that yet, but I want you to understand how those two textbooks, you know, are working together and what's different about them, okay? So then you have descending motor pathways that eventually communicate with the lower motor neurons, and we're talking alpha motor neurons, which go to the striated muscle, and then gamma motor neurons, which go to the muscle spindles within that muscle. So those are the two motor neurons. We'll be focusing on the alpha motor neurons in this session. So how do we move? Movement is orchestrated by a coordinated action of peripheral, spinal, brainstem, cerebellar, cerebral regions, shaped by a specific context and directed by the intentions of the performer. So anytime we think about movement, it's always in an environment. So whether you're, you know, on a ship at sea under rough seas and you're trying to maintain your balance because you're on a moving surface versus standing on something like this, I'm exerting movement and motor control in a given environment, you know, whether I'm lifting a heavy object or not. So make sure as a physical therapist, it's important to recognize the environment is just as important as the movement. And so as a therapist, you're either altering the task to maximize the benefit to the patient, or you're also altering the environment to allow those to match up appropriately to appropriate level of challenge you're trying to create or the movement you're trying to elicit. Just understand that movement always takes place within a certain environmental context, and the learner or the mover, the patient, also has their own personal limitations. So somebody trying to move who has a bad elbow flexion contracture, their triceps can work as hard as they want, but eventually it's going to stop because they have got an elbow flexion contracture. And unless you take care of that elbow flexion contracture, you're only going to get so much range or movement out of that tricep muscle. So just understanding some of those things is helpful to think big picture. Why do we move? Typically because we want to accomplish a task or a goal. We don't just typically move for movement's sake. We typically are moving to do something, to feed ourselves, to get over to that door, to open that door, to dress, to do things. So, and that's just saying that most of our treatment when we're working with patients who have mobility or motor limitations, they should be task specific. You just don't practice, you know, we typically don't just lift our arm up and down 10 times. We reach for a can 10, you know, we reach for an object, we pull something down, we manipulate a doorknob, we walk, you know, we get up and down from a chair. We don't do 10 leg lifts very often, you know. So just thinking about task specificity when we get to motor training. Locomotion is one of the most important attributes of living organisms because that gets you from one place to another. More than half of our nervous system is directly involved in motor performance. It's an incredible feat for our bodies to move. It's an incredible feat for me just to stand here without falling over. It's unbelievable. I mean, to develop robots or, you know, that have gyroscopes and things that can just stand and not fall over, especially like on a small platform or on wheels, it took, you know, all this time. We just now started getting these in the last few years. It's an incredible task just to stand and not fall over. And the most common indication of a nervous system lesion is a motor deficit. The most common symptom of any type of nervous system lesion is some type of motor deficit. And this is because over half your nervous system is directed towards motor output. And so if somebody has a nervous system problem, it's pretty, you know, a good chance that there could be a motor problem with that. So then for us, that's good for us. That's good business for us. We're involved with motor stuff. So here's the sequence of events involved in a voluntary movement, okay? This is one that you choose to do, that's you initiate, okay? You make a decision to do the movement. There are motor planning areas just in front of your primary motor strip that have stored programs of previous things you've done that are similar in nature, and you may say, hey, this is gonna be a sit to stand. I've got that little program in the motor planning area. Let's tap into that little program that knows how to coordinate those muscles. That goes typically down through some control circuits, more specifically the basal ganglia. So you intend to do the movement. You fire some neurons in the motor planning areas. Those neurons go down through the basal ganglia, the basal ganglia says, yay or nay, we're going to elicit or allow this movement to occur, or we're going to allow it to occur with this certain level of amplitude and force and so forth. Goes back up to your primary motor strip, which is just behind the premotor areas. Then the primary motor strip sends a signal down one of these descending pathways to go tell your lower motor neurons to make the motion happen. So you don't just send signals straight from a primary motor area to the lower motor neuron. You go to typically a planning area. The planning area goes through the basal ganglia, back up to the primary motor strip, and then you finally release the signal to tell your muscles what to do. Okay? You do often, don't forget spinal interneurons. So these spinal pathways, that while some of them directly communicate with the lower motor neurons, spinal interneurons that are at the level of the spinal cord where you're sending those signals will influence motor output as well. Inhibitory or excitatory interneurons play a role because you have a lot of converging input right at that spinal cord level. You have the descending motor pathway coming down, but at that spinal cord level, you have all that sensory information coming in. Some of that sensory information goes up to your cerebellum, some goes to your cerebral cortex, but a lot of it goes right to the spinal cord and can actually influence movement via reflexes right at the spinal cord level by communicating with interneurons that all that information convening together at that level of the spinal cord is what influences the ultimate output of the motor system to the skeletal muscles. Your book starts at the lower motor neuron, so we're going to start the lower motor neuron. I almost wish they'd start the cerebrum and work their way down, but we're just going to stay in sync with your book here. You guys cover in physiology some basics of muscle contraction, right? So we kind of skipped that part of it because you guys talk about that in physiology. So lower motor neurons. A lower motor neuron is that cell body that lies in the spinal cord and its axon that goes out to the muscle or muscle spindle. So alpha motor neuron goes to the skeletal muscle, the gamma motor neuron that goes to the muscle spindle. So let's talk about alpha motor neurons. The cell body lies in the ventral horn of the spinal cord. It goes out the spinal cord versus the ventral root, anterior root. It innervates extrafusal, skeletal muscle. It uses acetylcholine, and these are carried on large myelinated A-alpha axon fibers. So remember we had axon classifications for sensory fibers that are bringing you that information. We also have a classification for axons for the motor fibers that's a little different, and these are called A-alphas. They're just large myelinated fast axons that are coming out of these anterior horn cells, alpha motor neurons. So this is just showing you that picture. There's a pool, a bunch of alpha motor neurons sitting there near each other in that anterior horn. These are the axons. Those are all A-alpha axons that are coming out the ventral rootlets and the ventral root. So the little tiny divisions are the little rootlets. They form the root and then eventually into the spinal nerve. Okay, and this is that mixed spinal nerve that's containing sensory, autonomic, and now motor information, and then going to a muscle fiber. Okay. Then we have gamma motor neurons. The cell bodies for those lie also in the ventral horn, right near the anterior horn cells of the alpha motor neurons. They also exit the ventral root, but they innervate the intrafusal muscle fibers. So here's that muscle spindle in here, the little ends of the muscle spindle, the interfusal muscle fibers, those are the gamma motor neurons. Those are axons associated with those particular neurons are called A-gamma neurons. Okay, makes sense, A-gamma. They're medium myelinated, so they're a little smaller and a little less myelinated than the A-alphas. Okay, so they're a little slower, just a little slower. Let's talk about the concept of a motor unit. A motor unit is a single alpha motor neuron and all the muscle fibers it innervates is called a motor unit. So here is that single alpha motor neuron. It goes out to the muscle and it branches and it will innervate a certain number of muscle fibers. Okay. When we talk about like your arm, and especially your hand and forearm and the anterior horn region of your cervical spine, C5, C6, C7, C8, T1, you have lots of anterior horn cells going to smaller numbers of motor units. You have lots of little motor units. Does that make sense why you want to have lots of little motor units for muscles of the hand and forearm? Because you're having to do fine control. You want to activate very select specific regions of your muscle and be able to grade force very easily. So you have these you have a large number of alpha motor neurons going to with smaller motor units, but you have lots of them. You have lots of small motor units. That gives you a lot more graded ability to move in a finer fashion, grade force, move the muscle just enough that you need to. When you go to muscles like your butt and your thigh and all that, you have less alpha motor neurons, but they're innervating larger numbers of muscle fibers, and you have large motor units, but less numbers of motor units, because you're just making these big gross contraction, like extend my knee, flex my hip, flex my knee, extend my hip. You're just contracting these larger muscle groups without so much. They don't need that kind of control. So kind of like with the sensory system, remember our fingers had these lots of small receptive fields. Similarly, we have lots of small motor units in our fine muscles. Then we have these larger motor units that aren't so finely controlled in our big muscles that are just for big gross movements. Okay. Let's talk about fast and slow twitch motor units. Okay. So slow twitch fibers are typically associated with postural and slowly contracting muscles, so postural muscles. Slow twitch muscle fibers, they're more fatigue resistant. They can contract for long periods of time, but they contract a little slower and so forth. Then we have fast twitch muscle fibers. Those are referred to as type 2As and 2Bs. Has nothing to do with the axon. That's not an axon diameter thing. That's just the type. That's now referring to a muscle type. Okay, and this is where those things can get confusing. So type 2A and 2Bs, these are more for phasic power-producing muscles. Your muscle fiber, the type of muscle fiber it is, depends on the innervation that you have. They've actually done experiments where they've taken fast twitch muscle fibers and slow twitch muscle fibers, take the neuron and swap them, and then what will happen is the muscle fibers that were fast twitch, if you put a slow twitch neuron on it, now those muscle fibers turn to slow twitch. And if you take the, vice versa, you can turn the muscle into whatever the neuron that's actually innervating it is sending that signal to. And over several days or weeks, that muscle will turn to either fast twitch or slow twitch. Okay. So it's really dependent on the nerve innervation that you have, which we don't change our nerve innervation typically, so that's usually not a phenomena. But it's not the muscle fiber that determines what it's going to be. It's the innervation that determines how that muscle fiber is going to function. Okay. What's interesting though, so that makes this little counterintuitive, is that slow twitch muscle fibers fire first during most movements because they have smaller cell bodies in the anterior horn and they depolarize faster. Even though the axon is a little bit slower, that sends signals on these, and they don't quite, go as fast. They arrive earlier because they actually depolarize a little bit before the fast twitch ones do. So this is the reason why, or can you think of a reason why you'd want your slow twitch muscle fibers to actually fire before your fast twitch muscle fibers? Stabilization, postural control. So if I'm going to do like a really quick movement, like, whoa, reach my hand up to catch something, I actually need, in order for me to do that, I've got to counterbalance this arm reaching up quickly by firing my trunk extensors to counteract the weight of my arm out here. And also, I need to stabilize my scapula too to do this so it doesn't hurt my shoulder and provides enough stability to catch that ball. So I want my proximal scapula and muscle trunk fibers to fire a little bit before my deltoid fibers and biceps fire really quickly to do that. So what happens is as your body starts to do that, the cell bodies for your slow twitch muscle fibers of your postural muscles, they fire just a millisecond before your fast twitch fibers can fire. The signal gets there at the same time from your brain saying to do it, but those little, smaller cell bodies, there's less sodium that has to transfer to get those to depolarize. So they depolarize a little bit before, just enough so they can send their signal. Even though the axon's a little slower, it still arrives to those proximal muscles just before the signal gets to the fast twitch muscles, okay? So, I mean, you can do exercises to enhance your slow twitch versus your fast twitch muscle fibers, and you can selectively train some of those, but you have certain genetics that, you know, we all know. Some of us are more slow twitch people, some are more fast twitch people. You can maximize what you have available genetically, but you can't change your genetics or change the number of slow twitch and fast twitch muscle fibers. I guess you can. You can add muscle fibers in those areas, but you're limited to how much you can do at a certain point. You know, not all of us are sprinters or jumpers and those kind of things. And so that's why I do long distance aerobic activities, because I know my body's more. And I'll even people get very specialized in their sports. If you do enough, you know, exploration, there's people that are, you know, 800-meter people, and then there's people that are 1,600, and there's people that are Ironmen, you know, and their body systems, and that is partially dependent on genetically their makeup of slow twitch and fast twitch muscle fibers, and finding what sport. There's a sport for everybody to opt that you can function in if you know what you're kind of, people that are kind of a good mix, or these are good for these sports. People who are on the fast twitch are good at these sports. People on the slow twitch side are good for these sports. Remember that the sensory system is always bringing in information that influences our motor system, okay? So we always have constant information coming in from our muscle spindles, our Golgi tendon organs, our joint receptors that are telling us about muscle length, rate of change in length, and that information is processed at multiple levels. As soon as that information comes in those dorsal roots to either go up the dorsal columns, okay, or it'll actually have collaterals that'll send some of that information right to that spinal cord level. So it can modify motor signals coming down immediately. Some of that, though, goes up to your cerebral cortex to give you conscious awareness. Some goes to the cerebellum for the role that cerebellum will play in motor control. So there's this converging amount of sensory information, especially on those interneurons, that will influence your motor output, either upregulate or to downregulate, okay? And this happens at the spinal cord, the brainstem, the cerebellar, and the cerebral level. Sensory inputs coming in, it's being processed at all those levels, and then you have descending pathways that help modify that, okay? Or you can modify the next signal coming down to tell it, hey, this wasn't supposed to happen that way. Now I need to make a modification to my motor system to make it happen the way I thought it should happen, or what I was hoping to play. When we get to the cerebellum, we'll talk about that, the specific role it plays there. So all this picture is just representing the converging amounts of information. So here you have, let's say you have a bunch of information coming in for proprioception here, okay? A lot of that goes up the dorsal columns, right? But some of that goes directly into the dorsal horn and synapses on interneurons and alpha motor neurons directly. Here's the input from open motor neurons of the brain. So here's the lateral cortical spinal tracts out here. So we have this influence coming down. But then here's spinal interneurons. There's little spinal interneurons that are within that are getting lots of input from other methods, and those can influence the alpha motor neuron, how excitable it is or not at any given moment. So let's talk about the concept of kind of alpha-gamma coactivation. So during most movements, the alpha and gamma motor neuron system functions simultaneously. So when you're sending signals to your alpha motor neurons, you're sending them to the gamma motor neurons that are right near it, okay? And they're all exiting out together, going to that same muscle. And here's part of the reason why. So we know our muscle spindles are a sensory organ, they're a receptor, and they help us determine length of our muscles, how quickly our muscles changing length, and also the tension in our muscle at any given moment. So on the left is an example of, this is going to be a resting length situation. So here's our muscle at a whatever. Let's say my biceps. I'm sitting here, my elbow slightly flexed. There's some tension on my muscle, and I'm holding it in this position. There's a muscle spindle in there right now that's going beep, 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 and sending signals telling me that there's this much tension on my muscle right now. Right now it's not changing length, and it's sending this base signal, beep, 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 that tells me that I'm just holding it in this position at that resting length. So that is this signal right here. So here's our muscle spindle, and this is a sensory 1A, 1B, whatever, going up and telling me about that resting length and tension. Okay? I start to contract that bicep, and it's contracting. If I'm sending just a signal to just the muscle and not to the muscle spindle, it shortens. And what we see is that when you shorten that, take the tension off that muscle spindle, that signal rate goes down. And so initially when I do that, and I change to a shortened position, when that signal rate goes down, that's an indication to my brain and my body that that muscle got shorter. Okay? But now, if I don't do anything else, now there's this slack in the muscle spindle. The muscle is tightened because the muscles have contracted, but there's slack in that muscle spindle. So if I don't send a signal to the muscle spindle to adjust to that new length, I have this kind of floppy muscle spindle that's slack sitting in the muscle. And when it's on slack, it's not sending any signal. So it no longer is telling me much about the new length. Initially, it tells me it's shortened, but then since the signal's kind of shut off, it doesn't tell me much more about my new length in that muscle because it's on slack. It's just kind of sitting there on slack and not giving me that base signal to tell me what the new length is. And if also, all of a sudden, if I were to lengthen my muscle pretty quickly, since it's on slack, it would take a few moments or milliseconds to get enough stretch on it again to start making the signal spike to tell me all of a sudden that my muscle's getting longer or how rapidly that's occurring. Okay? So what happens is as you contract your muscle, you do get the little initial shortening briefly that tells you it's getting on the muscle spindle that your muscle's changing length, it's getting shorter. But then very quickly, the gamma motor neuron arrives just a few milliseconds later because remember the gamma motor neurons are they're medium myelinated. So initially the alpha motor neurons and the gamma motor neurons fire at the same time. The alpha motor neuron signal gets to the muscle first. The muscle contracts. The muscle spindle goes a little on slack, tells you that your muscle is contracting, and then very quickly you're at a new length of your muscle. Your muscle spindle fires, the gamma motor neurons go to the muscle spindle and say, tighten up and adjust to that new length. Okay, because now we're at this new length. Now that allows that muscle spindle to set a little bit of a basal signal again because it's on a slight amount of stretch. So now it's ready again at this new position. I can either go shorter and it'll register a signal again, or I can go longer and it'll register a signal again. Does that make sense? Because it's setting what's called the gain or the sensitivity of the muscle spindle. You want your muscle spindle to maintain a certain amount of sensitivity no matter how long the muscle is, whether it's short, long. Because if it gets too short, you don't contract that muscle spindle, you get this muscle spindle that's in there that's floppy and doesn't have enough stretch or sensitivity to adapt and pick up even minute small changes from that position in your muscle. Does that make sense? Why you have to activate those very similarly?
Spindle lengthening and not telling your hamstring to inhibit as well. Do you understand what I'm saying?
There's reciprocal inhibition, which we'll talk about. So when you're contracting one muscle, you'll inhibit the muscle that's doing the opposite action. If you were to pull a hamstring like pain-wise, like pull a hamstring, the pain signal from that muscle will go and shut you down, but it doesn't have anything to do with the muscle spindle. Yeah. So now there are some people who will say that deep tendon pressure or deep muscle pressure, by providing like an artificial pressure on the muscle spindle, if you put pressure on that muscle spindle for a long time, it'll it'll habituate to that pressure, and it'll actually down-regulate its signal a little bit, so it becomes a little less sensitive from maintained pressure. And some people will do that before they do like a stretch to somebody with a spastic muscle. So they might go in and put really deep pressure with their thumbs, or even wrap it with compression to press on the muscle, and you press on the muscle spindles in there for a long period of time, like 2 to 5 minutes. Those muscle spindles say, hey, we're tired of being pushed on and stretched. We're going to, and they're sending signals, but the muscle isn't changing. It's just staying statically compressed. It says, let's down-regulate that signal a little bit, be a little less sensitive, so that now when I actually do stretch the muscle, it doesn't quite kick in as quickly to create that monosynaptic stretch reflex, and so that I can stretch it. And or icing it too. Icing it will inhibit the muscle spindle too. To stretch a muscle, you actually, for people with spastic muscles that are neurologically spastic, icing the muscle, even though the muscle gets stiffer viscoelastically, you down-regulate, you inhibit the nerves, the nervous system, the alpha and gamma motor nerves, because it makes the signals, you decrease the action potential, speed, and ability, because the colder a nerve is, the less movement of ions across that nerve, right, if you cool it down. So that's alpha gamma coactivation. So that was kind of the lower motor neuron part of things. Alpha motor nerves sitting in that anterior horn cell, and gamma motor nerves, how they function, motor neuron pools, that kind of stuff. Now we're in the spinal region, okay? We're not in the pathways yet. We're just what's happening at the spinal level as far as motor control. A lot happens at the spinal level. It's amazing how much. Most of our ability just to walk has nothing to do with our brain. It's purely spinal cord and brainstem. Okay, so a lot of walking, just the ability to do this. Once I decide I want to walk, I just keep walking because I'm getting stretch on my hip flexors. It sends a signal to my spinal cord that says, hey, you're getting a stretch on your hip flexor back here. You better take the next step with the other leg. So, and it's a multi-level segmental reflexes that keep this flexion, extension, reciprocal, the stretch on the bottom of my foot, on my gastroc, the pressure on the ball of my foot. Those all go up to the spinal cord and signal me to take another step without ever getting any signals from my cerebral cortex other than stop or move around that object. But once I'm just going, I don't have to think about it. It's mostly a spinal cord reflex. And that's how people with spinal cord injuries that they put up on a harness and just kind of suspend them over a treadmill, and you start moving the treadmill, their legs just kind of move because of the spinal cord reflexes called central pattern generators that are built into our central nervous system. It's primarily the spinal cord and a little bit of brainstem level too. We've talked about dermatomes, but we have myotomes. It's the motor equivalent of a dermatome is a myotome, and that's simply the group of muscles that are innervated primarily by a single spinal nerve. So we typically associate, it's not perfect, there's overlap, and some of these groups are innervated by more than this, but when we talk about C5, we're mostly talking elbow flexion. We know C6 also contributes to elbow flexion, but C5 is the biggest contributor to elbow flexion. C6 is the biggest contributor to wrist extension, okay? C7, elbow extension. I don't need to read these. You guys have learned these. This is your myotome screen, right? So you should refamiliarize yourself. This is clinically important, okay? So this is when a single spinal nerve is damaged. You're going to have a dermatome. If you damage a single spinal nerve, you're likely to have a dermatonal loss of sensation, but also a myotomal loss of function, okay? So. When you talk about a spinal nerve, and it's got autonomic nerves, motor nerves, sensory nerves, some are more susceptible to getting damaged and seeing earlier loss than others. So it's very common, like with somebody with a bulging disc or spinal stenosis or something that pushes on that spinal nerve. Initially, the axons that tend to be most susceptible early on are the more slow, less myelinated, unmyelinated, smaller, finer axons. They tend to have problems earlier. So that's why oftentimes they'll start as pain. Like, ooh, I got this achy pain down my arm, right into this area here. Oh, C6 dermatome. It's a dermatonal. They're having this ache and pain like a paresthesia. That's because of starting to get pressure enough on these unmyelinated axons that they're starting to get a little ischemic. they're not working as well, but they're signaling, giving them some pain signals. Eventually you start pushing on some of the larger myelinated nerves that are a little more protected because of their myelination, and they're a little less susceptible to being slowed down because they have myelination. But eventually you start pushing on those, and they start feeling numbness. Like, this whole arm is numb. Being numb where you can't feel that's worse than having just a little bit of pain or paresthesias. If it's actually numb, that's not good. And usually at that point, you've also got weakness because you've pushed on axons that are the bigger ones and the myelinated ones that are also associated with the motor system. So they start losing reflexes and start having weakness. And two, that's when I'm really worried. If I have a patient with a back pain or neck pain who's just got some paresthesias and some pain, but their proprioception is okay and their motor strength is okay, that's not like an emergent situation. But if somebody walks in and they've got feels like a piece of wood down here, and you stick a needle in there and they don't feel a damn thing, or they can't even feel their toe when they move it up and down, which position, or can't feel vibration, and then they notice that they can't even lift their toes up and they have toe drag, you got to go see a surgeon, man. You don't need to be seeing me right now. I need to get you back to your doctor. You've got so much compression of that nerve, you're damaging all the axons in that spinal nerve, not just a few. You haven't just irritated a few axons in there, you've really compromised that spinal nerve significantly. This is just showing you cross sections through the spinal cord at various levels. So here in the cervical spine, that's a cross section through this particular region of your spinal cord called the cervical enlargement. So there's a spot in your cervical spine from about C4 to C7 or C8 that bulges out a little bit. And the reason it bulges out is because there's a lot of stuff going on in there. That's all your supply to your upper extremities, your motor and sensory systems. So you have see how these big anterior horns? Because you have lots of anterior horn cells in there. Because you have a lot of anterior horn cells, lots of axons going to a ton of small motor units to work those fine muscles of your hand, forearm, okay? And so you have this big, huge anterior horn. You get down to the thoracic spine, check out those little anterior horns. And it's narrower because they're only going to just your intercostals, some multifidi, a few erector spinae, and so there's hardly any anterior horn cells in there because there's not a lot of, and those muscles are functioning just kind of grossly, like you're just firing your whole, latissimus dorsi, or you're firing these more gross, in a gross function kind of way. And you get down to the lumbar spine, you have another thing called a lumbar enlargement, okay? You do have some pretty big ventral horns here. You do have, these muscles are so large of your hips and thighs that you still need a decent amount of anterior horn cells to supply those, even though they're supplying larger motor units, but the muscles are so dang big, So, you got this big old glute. You may have, 50 motor units that have to be supplied there, but it's in that big muscle. Where here, you might have my, thenar muscle, and I've got 50 motor units in there, but they're just small little motor units. So you still have pretty big anterior horns there, but even though it's going to less motor units because the muscles are so much bigger, okay? So let's talk about the concept of motor neuron pools, or pools of these motor neurons. These are axons from a motor pool that project basically to a single muscle. So like my bicep has a motor neuron pool. And that motor neuron pool may extend for more than one segment of the spinal cord. So C5 and C6, like my bicep has both C5 and C6. So there's a pool of anterior horn cells. All of the ones that go to my bicep are considered a motor neuron pool. And that motor neuron pool extends down through the anterior horn, or the anterior horn of that spinal cord, both at the C5 and C6 levels, okay? And they're contributing to those nerves that go to those spinal nerves. The axons from that motor neuron pool go through C5 and C6 into those spinal nerves. That's the motor neuron pool. When we look at an anterior horn, and we'll show you how this divided up, anterior horn cells that tend to hang out and lie in the medial part of the anterior horn, called the medial pool, those ones tend to go to axial and proximal muscles. If they hang out in the more lateral pool, they tend to go more towards distal muscles. That makes good sense, right? I mean, at least it makes logical sense to me that the more medial motor neurons go to more proximal muscles, the more lateral motor neurons go to more distal muscles. If they're more anterior in the motor neuron pool, they tend to go to more extensor type muscles. If they're more posterior, they tend to go to more flexor type muscles. Part of this has to do where the pathways, the descending motor pathways, are running in the spinal cord as they relate to that anterior horn. So let's show pictures. So this is a nice picture that helps me remember how the motor neuron pools. So you have these motor neuron pools that are lying, in your anterior horn, okay? If you picture an arm in there like that, that gives you the general arrangement of how this motor neuron pool setup is. So motor neurons, so little cell bodies that go out to your muscles through the spinal nerve. If they happen to be going to more proximal type muscles at a given level, they tend to be located more proximally in that anterior horn. So more in this region here, more proximal, more close to the middle. If they're going to be going to more distal muscles, they're going to be lying out here more distally. If they happen to be going to more of a flexor type muscle, they're going to be hanging out more posteriorly. If they're going to an extensor type muscle, they're going to be hanging out more anteriorly. So if I am a deltoid muscle, I'm a flexor of the shoulder and I'm proximal. So I'm going to be hanging back here. I'm going to be, my cell body for that goes to those, that projects to that muscle, are going to be hanging out more posteriorly because it's a flexor, and more proximal, okay, because it's a proximal muscle. So those tend to be more, those motor neuron pools that would be going to that, those anterior horn cells to that deltoid muscle will be laying in this region here, and they all be going out to that deltoid muscle. Our deltoid muscle, that be in probably the C5 area that's going to that, C4, C5 region that's going to that. If you want to picture a leg on here, you can picture a leg, because this is true for the lower limb too, but picture your leg like this. This is your foot here. See what I'm saying? So you're kind of laying like this in there with your foot bent up like this. And that's how your leg would be. So this is more extensors lie more. So if I'm a quad, that's still kind of a proximal muscle, and it's an extensor. So my quad motor neuron pool is going to be laying more in this region. So those L2, L3, L4 anterior horns at those levels, the motor neuron cell bodies for the quad are going to be laying more proximal and anterior. Does that make sense? And so when you start looking at the descending pathways in a few minutes here, we'll notice that there's a lateral cortical spinal tract, there's a rubrospinal tract here in the upper body for the cervical spine. You notice how they're lying right here, so they're close to distal flexors, motor neuron pools. And guess what? They happen to go to distal flexors. They happen to go to the distal flexor type muscles, both of the lower limb and the upper limb, but mainly actually the upper limb more so than the lower limb. Then here we'll talk about a bunch of little we call medial activating pathways that lie in this region here. Those are activating pathways that come from, one of them comes from your cortex, but most of them come from your brainstem, and they're going to innervate muscles that tend to extend your body and are also postural muscles. They provide that background basic postural control, stabilization, and so forth. Those descending pathways are more primitive in nature. They're non-voluntary, they're less voluntary, they're more just automatic postural things. And you notice that they happen to be pretty close to these motor neurons that lie more in that extensor and medial type regions for postural muscles that tend to go to postural muscles. So anatomically they're near each other, and that makes sense why they would be there. this is kind of showing you that same thing. This is just another representation of a picture showing you where those motor neuron pools, how they tend to lie. You know, tracks, motor tracks that come down in this lateral funiculus of the spinal cord tend to be more flexor bias tracks and distal bias tracks, where the tracks that lie in this anterior funiculus tend to be more extensor and proximal muscle bias tracks. So spinal region coordination, some of the things that happen at the spinal cord level, some of our basic muscle synergies. When we go to move, we often use muscles very synergistically, like the same muscles work together all the time. This is a flexion synergy, bringing something to my mouth like this. A lot of that is mediated at the spinal cord level. When I start to contract my bicep, it may send signals to my deltoid to flex a little bit, my wrists, they communicate, they reinforce each other, okay? So there's certain motions, like if I'm pressing up from a chair, that's an extension synergy, and my triceps work with my rear deltoid, work with my lats and my trunk extensors to do that, and a lot of that happens at the spinal cord level, of just the different levels of your spinal cord talking to each other to say, hey, looks like you're going to be doing a pushing activity, let's get these muscles to work like they normally do, together, like this. So lots of synergies we have. Lifting my leg like this to walk is a flexion synergy. Standing on my legs during stance is an extension synergy position. So these stepping pattern generators we talked about, they're called CPGs, just the basic flexion extension of your leg once you get that walking going. That's spinal region coordination. Basic reflexes, taking the hammer and tapping on somebody's tendon, or if I'm standing here and I start to sway forward, my gastrocs get a quick stretch and they pull me back. And then my anterior tibs get a little stretch and they pull me back. And it keeps me upright. I'm accentuating the sway here a little bit. Hopefully I'm accentuating it. So those are reflexes. Or you step down off of a step that's a little bit bigger than you thought it was, and your knee starts to collapse because you hadn't had your quad turned on quite enough for it, and your quad starts stretching faster than your body expected, or like, holy crap, the muscle spindle gets stretched, sends a signal back to your spinal cord, says, quad, turn on, stronger, because or else it's going to collapse. And you turn it on, and then you hopefully don't collapse. Or if you're an old person and your tendon's not ready for that, you get a quad tendon tear because your muscle fires so strongly. That's a common reason that old guys like me who don't try to stay in shape, or if they don't stay in shape, if they don't keep their musculotendinous junctions in shape, that's when people, my buddies that want to go play that pickup basketball game, or they just step off a step wrong, that's when you tear your quad tendon, you tear your gastroc tendon, you go skiing, your body's just not prepared for those, unanticipated responses that it has to make these strong contractions of a muscle to keep you from falling, and then you still fall anyway because you tear your quad tendon. Reciprocal inhibition is another basic spinal cord reflex type of thing, where as I'm flexing my bicep, my tricep gets inhibited, so it doesn't interfere with that flexion. It doesn't fight me. Okay, so we'll show you these real quick, and then hopefully we'll take a break here once we get done with this part of it. This is showing you reciprocal inhibition. So let's say this is showing you extending your quad. They don't have the alpha. So you're sending an alpha motor neuron. Actually, they do show the alpha, sorry. So here you are telling your quad to contract and extend, right, through the alpha motor neuron. The muscle spindle senses that, okay? It gets shorter and it knows, hey, I'm contracting this muscle actively. The muscle spindle sends a signal back to the spinal cord. The muscle spindle will actually go and reinforce the contraction that it's getting at the quadricep. It's a self-reinforcing type of response. But at the same time, via an inhibitory interneuron, it may send a signal to the hamstring to turn it down, turn it off through the inhibitory interneuron. Now they're showing this happening at the same spinal region. That's not happening at that same level. Actually, you have to go down. If you have to go, your hamstrings are L-S1, L5, S1 kind of region where so it's going down a few segments to tell it to do that. But we're keeping it simple here to represent what's generally occurring here is that This is reciprocal inhibition. When you're contracting one muscle, you actually reinforce the contracting muscle and inhibit the opposite or antagonistic muscle to not get in the way of it. Basic reflexes. Used to think that the reflexes were the sole basis of movement at one time. They just thought basically complex movement was a string of lots of little reflexes built together. Okay. We know, however, there is voluntary movement, and that movement is a nice balance between voluntary and reflex that meld together. You can get some idea of the integrity of the motor system at the peripheral and spinal cord level with reflexes. So doing reflexes will give you some idea of the integrity. We've already talked to you guys about the stretch reflex, the DTR, the basic monosynaptic stretch reflex. When you stretch that muscle, you cause that autogenic facilitation, which this is this thing right here, this reinforcement of the contraction that you get, that's that autogenic facilitation. That's actually a positive excitatory loop, positive reinforcement loop you get when you're contracting that muscle. So with the stretch reflex, boom, you tap on the tendon, the muscle spindle stretches and sends a signal back to that same muscle to contract even more strongly. And then that's why you get the muscle to kick out. You also do have reciprocal inhibition going on here. You're not showing it, but there's actually a signal sent to your hamstring to say, don't get in the way of this motion. But this is the reinforcing, so this is the sensory part of that stretch. So here you tap on the patellar tendon, which causes a shortening of the patellar tendon, which causes little tiny stretch of the quad, but it's a fast stretch. That's the key, is the speed of the stretch. Your muscle spindle is very responsive to speed. If it feels like your muscle stretching really quickly, it knows it's got to do something. Turn that muscle on, keep it from collapsing or whatever it thinks is going to happen. It's monosynaptic. It involves only one synapse, and it involves really fast nerve fibers, both your alpha motor neurons and your 1A afferents from your muscle spindle. So it's boom, because it has to be fast. That keeps you from falling over when something happens and you have to make a quick adjustment to muscle tension based on what's happening at the muscle. There's phasic stretch reflexes and tonic stretch reflexes. The tapping on the tendon is the phasic stretch. That's when you have this rapid change, even a small change in the length of that muscle spindle. It's the fact that it's really rapid, and that rapidity of it really strengthens and enhances the response. Then there's a phasic reflex. If I'm just standing here, most of us stand with like about 5 degrees of knee flexion or so. I have a slight amount of knee flexion. There's a little bit of tension on my quad all the time in standing, and that maintains a self kind of stimulation to maintain. As long as that senses there's some tension on it, my muscle stays turned on. That's the tonic reflex. There's a tonic type reflex that doesn't go away. It doesn't habituate. It just stays in the background. If I'm just holding like, something and trying to not let it fall down, there's a tonic reflex that keeps going back and reinforcing that muscle contraction as long as there's tension. And then if I quickly change this length of that really quick, it reinforces it with a phasic stretch superimposed on that tonic response. Does that make sense? So you can still superimpose a tonic or a phasic stretch reflex on top of your tonic reflex that just maintains. The tonic reflex is really important for, why eccentric contractions you can generate a lot more force with an eccentric contraction than you can with a concentric contraction, because in an eccentric contraction the muscle is lengthening, but so is the muscle spindle. And as the muscle spindle keeps getting lengthened, it sends signals back to the muscle to make it work harder. Okay? Where if I'm doing a concentric contraction, that muscle spindle is shortening and it's not sending reinforcing signals back to the muscle to keep it autogenically facilitated. So that's why eccentric contractions you can always generate more force with. And sometimes a patient, like a stroke patient or something like that, we often start, if they can't generate a concentric contraction, it's actually a little harder to generate a concentric contraction than an eccentric, because the eccentric contraction, inherently you have the muscle spindle stretching and reinforcing the contraction. So a lot of times if I can't get a patient to like lift their knee up like this, I can't get them to do a concentric extension of the leg, I lift their leg up and say, hold it and don't let it fall down. And it may just go like this and slowly lower it. That's what I'm looking for. I just don't want it to go like this. Then obviously if they're too weak to even do a good eccentric contraction, I may have to change the position of how I'm doing this. But I would just say, don't let the leg fall down. And then okay, now let's lift it up again. And I'll lift it up into place. Now I'm going to let it go. Just let it go down slowly. Good. And I might tap on their quad while they're doing that to reinforce that contraction, stimulate that muscle spindle some more. I might use vibration on the muscle while they're letting muscle lower. Then eventually we say, all right, let's see if you can do that concentric contraction. Or I might bring them up into this position, just say if you can just do that concentric contraction through that last little bit of motion. This works not only for stroke, but it works for your post-surgical total knees and those kind of things. If they can't generate a good concentric, you can start with an eccentric. But be careful, eccentrics make you sore. That's where you get lots of good, micro trauma to the muscle. But I just warn them, hey, you're going to be sore as hell tomorrow, but it'll go away. You'll be fine. I'll get over it. You can cuss at me. Let's talk about the GTO. We've already, it is a sensory organ in that musculotendinous junction. It tells us about tendon tension. The muscle spindle is more muscle tension. This is what's happening right at the musculotendinous junction. It helps to modulate muscle contraction and tension around the tendon. It never works by itself. And none of these work by themselves. Everything's converging onto the nervous system from your GTOs, your muscle spindles, your joint receptors all at the same time. None of them work in soul, by themselves. And so it's a combination of all the input that modulates or modifies output. The GTO may facilitate motion, or it may inhibit, or not, I shouldn't say motion, may facilitate the nervous system or inhibit based on the task. We used to think the GTO was only inhibitory. And we used to think, like, for example, like the GTO, the function was like a fail-safe for your muscle. Like if you put too much tension on the musculotendinous junction, that the GTO tells your muscle, shut off or you're going to hurt yourself. And so it would just cause you to collapse if you put too much tension. Or we would use it in the therapy side of things. We would think if we put a lot of pressure on the GTO, if we could put so much pressure with somebody's like a lot of tone or spasticity, we could get that GTO to kick in and turn the muscle off because it was thinking it was going to be damaged or threatened of damage, of too strong of a contraction by putting pressure directly on the GTO. We know that putting pressure on a muscle doesn't just activate the GTO. It just causes some habituation of both GTO, muscle spindles, that you get some dampening of the spasticity by just putting maintained pressure. But it also involves receptors in the skin and all kinds of things. So the GTO may be facilitatory or it may be inhibitory. During stance phase of walking, the GTO being stimulated in my gastroc, at my musculotendinous junction, and at my knee, it'll sense that I'm in a stance phase because there's proprioceptive input coming from my foot that'll say, hey, let's reinforce the muscle contraction along with the muscle spindle. Let's help maintain that stability. But once the pressure comes off the bottom of my foot, the proprioceptors on the bottom of my foot send signals to my spinal cord and then my GTO that say, hey, your foot's off the ground now. That musculotendinous junction, we want it to stretch, and let's release that and let's down-regulate it, because right now the muscle's being stretched, so the muscle spindle's turning on, but the GTO says, hey, we want to inhibit that because we're in swing now. We want that knee to unlock and just freely bend. We don't want the quad to get in the way of that. So the GTO will turn into an inhibitor because it knows it's not being on the ground, because it doesn't feel there's proprioceptors that are no longer telling the GTO your foot's on the ground. Does that make sense, sort of? So the GTO can work as an inhibitory or facilitatory depending on the task. One of the things it does is it does help to modulate and sense tension across the tendon. So musculotendinous junction. So here's the musculotendinous junction. Here's some 3 GTOs associated with 3 motor units or motor fibers, okay? And if you have a certain amount of tension, so here's the tension, weight hanging on there. If, for example, your muscle senses that there's too much tension on a specific region of the musculotendinous junction, like just in this middle region, what it can do is it'll send signals to your dorsal horn, which will then, in this case, this is an inhibitory interneuron, this black or darker one, and then it'll send a signal back to this motor unit to say, hey, we've got too much tension in the central region. Turn this central region motor unit down a little bit. These guys over here, there's not enough tension. They're not doing enough of their job. send signals to those, and these are positive reinforcing or excitatory interneurons. Tell them to upregulate a little bit, but we're looking for balance across that tension. We're looking for balance across that musculotendinous junction. So the GTO helps to kind of balance the tension across the musculotendinous junction, so not one region of that musculotendinous junction gets vulnerable to being torn or damaged. Does that make sense? And that's when, again, you can see it can have inhibitory or excitatory qualities depending on, it's a pretty darn smart little receptor to help modulate tension across so it's even. You don't want one part of your tendon getting too much tension and getting a little even small tear in your tendon, right? You'd rather have the whole tendon take its load appropriately across the tendon. Cutaneous reflexes that happen that are modulated at the spinal cord level. A couple ones here. One that you guys probably have heard about a lot. And this is the foot down here. It's hard to see it, but this is a guy stepping on a tack, and in this case, you get a flexor withdrawal. So if I'm going and I step on a tack, ooh, I got to lift that leg up, right? It's automatic. It happens at the spinal cord lever. My leg is lifting off that thing before I even sense pain, because the pain, conscious awareness of pain has to go all the way to my cortex, but you'll notice like, ooh, and you're already lifting your leg before you even felt that pain because it's happening at the reflex spinal cord level, okay? And so the spinal cord is sending, this is a multi-level polysynaptic reflex that goes to multiple muscle groups. It goes to my hip flexors, my hamstrings, my trunk has to turn on too, and then there's, if you're in a weight-bearing position, like I am in standing, there's a crossed extension part of the reflex. So the crossed extension is my flexors activate on one side, but my extensors have to activate on the other side. It's interesting though, but if I'm laying down on a table and somebody tickles my bottom of my foot, I'm only going to pull up the one leg. I'm not going to extend the other leg because I know I'm not in a weight-bearing position because I don't have proprioceptive input on the bottom of my foot. Does that make sense? So you only get the crossed extension if you're in a weight-bearing position most of the time. Some people still kind of push with the other leg, but it's a stronger response if you're actually in weight-bearing because you have to hold your body up against gravity. The arms, if I do and I touch a hot stove, whoa, like this, whoo, you know, that's a flexor withdrawal reflex. It's a cutaneous flexor withdrawal reflex. But my other arm doesn't extend, but unless I'm like this, I go to, and I put both my hands, oh, and I happen to be on a hot surface on this, I'm going to pull this arm up, but I'm going to extend this arm because it knows I'm in a weight-bearing position. That would be the crossed extension part of the reflex. That's all spinal cord mediated at multiple levels, that just between interneurons that are affecting that. The abdominal reflex is actually so abdominal reflex is you take a tuning fork or your thumb and you actually just scrape up the rectus abdominis on one side and it just causes a contraction of the rectus abdominis. It's like it's equivalent of a tendon reflex at your knee, but you do it in the abdominals. You're just looking. What you see is you look for the umbilicus to deviate towards the side you scraped. It's just causing the rectus abdominis to contract. It's a cutaneous surface reflex. You do this on people with spinal cord injuries and things like that to see, kind of looking for level of injury and if they got some contraction. And then the Babinski reflex, the plantar reflex. Have we showed you guys this? Scrape the bottom of the foot. And in adult, the normal thing you would do is your toes would kind of go down like this. When you scrape across the bottom of from the outside of the foot, across the medial, you underneath the metatarsal heads, you just go like this, and normally you'd go, and your foot would go like that. For an adult with an abnormal reflex, their big toe would extend and the little toes would flare out like this. That means you have damage to the descending pathways. You have an upper motor neuron. That's all that means, is you have an upper motor neuron problem. If you're an adult and I scrape the bottom of your foot and your big toe extends and your little toes and your other toes go out like this, that means there's some damage on the descending pathway that goes to those anterior horn cells in your lower limb. Okay, so it's a screen. It's a quick screen. This is where I have a patient who's got who maybe I'm thinking has multiple sclerosis. They come in thinking they have back pain. I go and I test their reflexes. Let's say I test their ankle reflex and their knee reflex, and they're high. Ooh, back pain from a peripheral problem typically doesn't. It causes lower reflexes. I tap on their high reflexes. Let me test this little Babinski thing. Scrape the bottom of their foot. Their big toe goes by like that. And I'm like, this is an upper motor neuron problem. This is not a back pain, lower motor neuron problem. Now, some people can have back pain and also have MS that's been undiagnosed, so you can have both. But I'm sending them back to the doctor at that point to say, let's get this checked out without trying to alarm them too much. Just saying some of your signs don't match up with what I consider typical of back pain. We're just going to get you back to your doctor, do a little quick checkup before we continue on with our treatment here, make sure we've got everything taken care of. The H reflex can be used to quantify excitability or lack of the alpha motor neurons. It's the electrical equivalent of a stretch reflex, but it's measurable. Tapping on somebody's tendon, I mean, you can see kind of grossly, like, how strong, you can grade it, 1+, 2+, 3+. But it's not very sensitive to looking at that or change. It's hard to do that. The H reflex is something that you can do not as a therapist, but typically as a physician could do an H reflex. They use it in research a lot when they're trying to get people to see if they can turn people's spasticity up or down. Usually down, like spinal cord injury patients, if they're doing exercise or some kind of a modality to try to make them so their legs don't jump around so much, they'll measure the H reflex as an indicator of whether they actually changed the person's excitability of their nervous system at the spinal cord level. This is a test of how excitable your reflexes are at the spinal cord level, but measurable. So here's how you do it, is the physician will put a stimulating electrode right here on your popliteal fossa as they're stimulating the popliteal nerve. They, send a certain strength of electrical stimulus from the stimulating electrode onto the popliteal nerve. Since you're stimulating right in the middle of the nerve, you send an action potential proximally and distally at the same time, right? You stimulate in the middle of the nerve, so a signal goes both ways. So the action potential goes up this way, and another signal goes down this way, down the nerve. You have a recording electrode down here on a lower part of the gastroc near the end of that nerve. The recording electrode initially picks up this initial volley, this initial stimulus that you did with the actual artificial stimulation. It picks that little stimulus up. It's called the M wave. And you can measure in millivolts how big that M wave was. That's determined on how strong the stimulus that they sent initially, okay? Then, a few milliseconds later, because this is going up your sensory neurons, and it's going up the big myelinated 1As that are normally associated with your muscle spindles, they go up into your spinal cord and they create basically a stretch reflex, a monosynaptic reflex where it connects to the alpha motor neurons. They go back down, and then this recording electrode picks up that signal that motor signal going down a few milliseconds later, and that's called the H reflex, or the H wave. And so that's what you're looking at, is how high that is. That's an indicator of excitability. The higher that is, the more excitable that reflex is. There's a certain window of normal, There's a normal amount of excitability you want, and there's too much and too little, okay? So that's the H reflex. Any questions on any of that? You're ready for a break, I'm sure. Come on back. It'll be fun, I promise. Yep. So I think it's helpful to think about the pathways in these two larger categories, the medial activating pathways versus the lateral activating pathways, okay? Medial, middle, postural, gross movement, so the muscles that are closer to the middle of our body, right? These are the pathways that tend to innervate those muscles, posture and gross movement. Only one of these pathways actually comes from your cortex. All the rest are brainstem, which kind of makes sense because the brainstem is more primitive in nature. It tends to be working more just some of those gross movements, okay? Postural gross movements. So these pathways in general, as a group, this is just good to understand some of the group characteristics of these. They tend to synapse on those motor neurons located medially in the ventral horn that go to those proximal muscles. So the motor neuron pools that lie more medially, and also ones that tend to lie a little more anteriorly for extensors, especially the extensors that are more proximal. In general, they tend to be extensor biased. when you think about posture and gross movement, why would most of these muscles want to be extensor biased? What are we doing all day long? What are we battling all day long? Gravity. And so when we're sitting up, standing up, getting in and out of bed, we're extending. We're moving against gravity. So extension, plantar flexion is a part of kind of an extension. These are the muscles that we're trying to affect here mostly, and they tend to be extensor biased. Okay. We're going to talk about 4 tracts from the brainstem and 1 that comes from the cortex. So these are the major pathways of the medial activating system. We've got the medial, or also referred to as the anterior. So books will interchange this. They'll call it the medial or anterior cortical spinal tract. Your book calls it the medial. Some books will call it the anterior. We have the lateral. This is the only one coming from the cortex, corticospinal, right? We have the lateral vestibulospinal tract. And we have a medial vestibulospinal tract. We're going to talk about a tectospinal tract that your book doesn't mention. However, the Lundy-Eklund book doesn't mention it, but the Crossman book mentions the tectospinal tract. And I put not in 4th and 5th editions. And then we're going to talk about a pontine or reticulospinal tract, also known as the medial reticulospinal tract. In your book, these are collectively referred to as just reticulospinal. Reticulospinal tracts. There's one other reticulospinal tract that we'll add in there, but it's considered part of the lateral activating system. So this is a cross-section through the spinal cord. This is a cervical segment because we've got a fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus. We've got nice big anterior horns. But let's just talk about where these medial activating system tracts are. It's all these guys right here that are running down in that white matter in the anterior medial region of the white matter there. Okay. So here's the pontine reticulospinal tract right here. This is the medullary reticulospinal tract. Well, actually, that's part of the lateral activity. You haven't talked about that one yet, sorry. The lateral vestibulospinal, the tectospinal, the ventral or anterior or medial cortical spinal tract. So any one of those terms apply, and that's why it's important to know that, because your textbook for Crossman calls it the ventral, which is the same as the anterior, which is the same as the medial cortical spinal tract, because it's medial, but it's also ventral or anterior. So I'm sorry, I pointed to the wrong thing with one of these. This pontine reticulospinal tract, it's this one here. It's this green one right here, this pontine reticulospinal tract. This one here is your medial vestibulospinal tract, but the medial vestibulospinal tract in the cervical spine, because it ends kind of in the cervical thoracic spine, it's also called, some people refer to it as the medial longitudinal fasciculus. It is the medial longitudinal fasciculus in the brainstem. Some people will call it the medial vestibulospinal tract when it gets into the spinal cord. Some people continue to call it the medial longitudinal fasciculus. So let's go through each of these. This is medial activating system pathways. Medial anterior / ventral cortical spinal tract. Basic function, what does it do? It innervates and controls axial and proximal motor control, more so of the neck, shoulders, and trunk, not so much of any leg function. It tends to die off by the time, this pathway tends to die off as it goes down the spinal cord, okay? It's more prominent in the cervical, thoracic, trunk regions. It begins in areas 4 and 6 of the cortex. Brodmann's areas. We're going to show you what these areas are later here in this lecture. Brodmann's areas 4 and 6, which is up in the cerebral cortex. That's where the cell bodies start. All these pathways have 2 orders of neurons, and we don't usually talk about it as a primary, secondary order neuron like we do the sensory pathway. We tend to reserve that terminology for the sensory pathways. All these motor pathways have one starting point, and then they end up connecting to the anterior horn cell as the next one. So the anterior horn cell is the secondary neuron pretty much. So that's a little easier because we don't have three stopping points. You know, we just got start and then kind of a stopping point. So what it does, it descends in what's called the corona radiata. The corona radiata, and we'll show you pictures, it's this area right here of all these axons coming down to gather together to squeeze down in between the thalamus and the basal ganglia structures to the internal capsule. So if it's coming from the cortex, if it's a motor pathway coming from the cortex, it's going to come down through the corona radiata into the internal capsule, through the front part of the midbrain. This front part of the midbrain right here, when you look at it in this cross section, in a horizontal section like that, it's called the crus cerebri. Crus cerebri. If we're looking at it from the front, and you're looking at the front part of this on the outside, it's called the cerebral peduncle. But when you look at it in cross section, through a horizontal section, this front part is called the crus cerebri. It runs down, these fibers run down through the ventral part of the pons, the front part, the ventral or basilar part of the pons. It's running down through that front part of the pons. Eventually, when it gets into the medulla, it ends up in this region called the pyramids, right? And the pyramids are sort of triangular and looking, both from the front and from the cross section. It's nice that they stay the same. If you're looking at the front, they're called the pyramids. If you look at them in cross section, they're called the pyramids. And then becomes the ventral or medial anterior cortical spinal tract. What's interesting about this medial cortical spinal tract is it will stay on the same side, but when it gets to its stopping point, it'll usually jump to the other side. So here you see it jumps to the other side at its stopping point. So it is still somewhat contralateral. However, not all of them jump over to that side. Some of them stay connected and communicate with anterior horn cells on the same side. So it's a mix. I don't know what the exact mix of. It might be 60% cross back over, 40% stay on the same side. So it's both ipsilateral and contralateral, but it's slightly more contralateral than ipsilateral. Not that critical to have that awareness, other than the fact that postural muscles tend to work together, right? When you fire muscles on one side of your body, you tend to fire them on the other side because you're stabilizing. So that it gets a little less, you don't have this pure contralateral function like with some motor pathways. There's oftentimes I just want to fire this one limb by itself. But postural muscles, if I'm lifting just my right limb, I'm firing postural muscles on both sides of my trunk. So there's a little more gray as far as, it's a little more, the way it innervates those muscles or those anterior horns, it's not pure contralateral or ipsilateral. There's usually a little bit of mix in these pathways. These medial activating pathways are not so pure contralateral and ipsilateral in nature. Some textbooks will tell you that this medial cortical spinal tract is purely ipsilateral, which is wrong. More of the fibers cross back over in the anterior white commissure and actually go contralateral. Again, I don't know what the exact percentage is, but there's a greater percentage that go contralateral, but there's still a significant that does stay ipsilateral and communicate with anterior horn cells on the same side. Okay. It ends mostly in the mid-thoracic region. Even though this picture shows it going down to the lumbar spine, fades out. It may be a few fibers that get down there, but it mainly ends in mid-thoracic. It's mainly for that, because your legs are more, you move your legs independently most of the time. It's your trunk muscles, your upper back, and your neck that you tend to fire muscles together for postural support and stabilization. That's what this guy does. This is the only one from the cortex that does this. The rest are going to be from brainstem centers. So this whole region, this whole region here is 4 and 6. This part right here, this is area 4, which is the primary motor area. And then this region 6, these are called Brodmann's numbers or Brodmann's areas. This region 6 is divided into 2 separate areas. It's got the supplementary, so if you think supplementary superior, it's higher. Then the premotor, it's in front of the primary motor strip, is also, but they're all, these together are considered area number 6 for Brodmann's numbers, but it's divided into supplementary and premotor area. And then our primary motor strip is all one, and it's Brodmann's area number 4. And you'll see these extend over to the medial surface, because remember we got some leg over here that hangs over the medial surface. This is where our leg, the homunculus for both our sensory and motor leg, is more over there. We have this other area right here, just on the left side of our brains. This is the left hemisphere, called Broca's area, which is for speech, motor planning for speech. But we're not worried about that right now. Don't worry about that right now. Let's start reorienting to some landmarks and some anatomy here. So here's our cross section through the cerebrum, right through here, right? It's a mid-horizontal cerebral, but it's a little bit angulated like this to stay in line with that. It's not a straight one across like this. It's kind of angled to match up with the neuraxis right here. And it's mid-horizontal cut. And we're looking right down on the top of this cut, and looking at the bottom half of the brain there, okay, through that mid-horizontal section. So let's start identifying some structures. This structure right out here is part of our basal ganglia. That's all you got to know right now. This structure right here, so let's just put BG. This structure here is also a basal ganglia structure, okay? BG. These two guys here, this is a thalamus and a thalamus on each side. The thing I want to point out here is this white matter structure that's shaped like a boomerang or a V, I don't know. This is your internal capsule. So this white matter region that I'm making red, that's the internal capsule. And the internal capsule can be divided into an anterior limb and a posterior limb. And then sometimes even a genu or a bend right in the middle, but most people just refer to an anterior limb and a posterior limb of the internal capsule. All of your motor and sensory fibers are running through the posterior limb of the internal capsule. And they all run right in this region right here, all layered in together, right there, right, and there. This region here is where you have all your sensory and motor fibers running from that through that internal capsule. The ones that are going to the cortex are coming from the cortex. So not all the brainstem ones and all that stuff, but this is just the ones that are going up to the cortex, or coming from the cortex in the case of the motor system. So here's a netter picture here showing you the homunculus on the cerebral cortex. So this is the cerebral cortex up at the top here. That's that area 4 and 6. Brodmann's areas 4 and 6. Here's all those lovely neurons starting in the cortex for your medial and lateral cortical spinal tract. Right now we're talking medial cortical spinal tract, but the medial and lateral start together and they run together. They come down. This is the internal capsule that we're showing here. Okay, internal capsule right there. You'd have your basal ganglia structures would be here. You'd have your thalamus here and here on each side. But they're just showing the internal capsule, posterior limb of the internal capsule. Everything's layered in there, right? And then here's that crus cerebri. This is that section through the brainstem or the midbrain. Crus cerebri. This is that front part of the pons coming down here. You'll notice that your face, arm, leg, all that stuff is all running together until you get into the pons. And then if you're going to be going to facial muscles and to some of the cranial nerves, you go to those cranial nerves for the motor function of the cranial nerves. If you're going down to the body, you just keep going down, and those body fibers divide. Most of them go to become the lateral cortical spinal tract and cross over. The ones that stay on the same side, those become your medial cortical spinal tract or your anterior cortical spinal tract, and they go down and communicate with motor neurons for your proximal trunk muscles, mostly contralaterally, but a fair amount of ipsilateral as well. This is showing you that anterior, this is the posterior limb of the internal capsule. This is front, this is back, this is the thalamus right here, this is the basal ganglia structure, so is this. But this is just showing you layering in of arm, leg, trunk through here. And then right behind it in blue, those are sensory fibers. This is a kind of a cool picture, how they dissected this. I don't know what it'd take to get this dissected like this, but what they did is they kind of really did a nice job of preserving. These are the corona radiata fibers that are coming from the cortex. That's what you're seeing here is the corona radiata. We would be talking about ones just coming from that primary motor strip and premotor areas, so they'd really be kind of these ones right in here that are coming from these regions right here. So this is that corona radiata. Right here through this region here, this is where it gets all squeezed down. This is the internal capsule. What they've done is they've actually taken off the basal ganglia structures. The thalamus is just deep to that. They left the thalamus in there, so you've got just the basal ganglia structures taken off. And you're seeing this is that internal capsule region. And then this is the midbrain here, and then this front part would be the crus cerebri area where those fibers are running. And then you can see the fibers running down this front part of the pons, the basilar pons. Here's some cool fibers going back to the cerebellum, which we'll talk about next time or in a few sessions. Those continue on down the front part of the medulla and the pyramids, and then eventually to the spinal cord. Become the medial and lateral cortical spinal tracts. Now here's a mid-coronal or frontal view. Just look at some of these same structures in a frontal view. So this is looking, cut the front part of the brain off, we're looking at the middle of the brain, looking towards that back part of the middle of the brain there. This would be our corona radiata fibers coming through here. This is through the posterior limb of the internal capsule where this section is taken. So this is that posterior limb of the internal capsule, but looking at it from a frontal view. And so then those fibers run down through here. And now we have it pretty well cut off. The midbrain, this is actually, the midbrain is right here. The midbrain extends all the way up into here. This is the mammillary bodies right here. This is some substantia nigra right here that you can't really see on that one side. But this would be running down, this would be starting the crus cerebri right up here, right in this region would be crus cerebri, and then it would go down. The front part of the pons would be down here, and then the medulla would be down here, and those would run down through there. Let's just highlight those other structures here. This is the basal ganglia structures here, here, and then this is thalamus here. Thalamus here, basal ganglia structures here and here. This is where it'd be good to go maybe after a lecture or session like this is to go to VR and look at the, some of these structures where the, internal capsule and all that stuff is and where these basal ganglia structures and or after the next few lectures and so forth, that'd be a good time to reinforce it with some of the VR stuff. So we're still on medial activating system. We just did medial cortical-spinal tract. Now we're on the medial vestibulospinal tract. What's its primary function? Regulation of activity of upper back and neck muscles in response to vestibular input. Okay, so if I'm sitting here and somebody tips me to the side, my vestibular system says, hey, you're being tipped to the side. Turn on the neck muscles on the right so you don't, and it just stabilize my neck to keep it from happening. I also have stretch receptors telling me that too, but my vestibular system adds to that. Or if I'm moving my head in different positions, the vestibular system is telling my body and my neck what is happening with the orientation of my head and can help tell the neck muscles how to respond appropriately to that movement. Does that make sense? Or if I'm like, if somebody tips me forward like this, or I'm in a car and I start to decelerate, my vestibular system senses that deceleration and turns my neck muscles on to counteract that deceleration. Okay? So does stretch receptors and things that reinforces it, but the vestibular system plays a role in that. And that's what the medial and lateral vestibulospinal tracts can help play some role in that. It's the medial vestibulospinal tract. It begins in the medial vestibular nuclei. Okay, starts in that's why it's called the medial vestibular spinal tract. We'll look at the vestibular. There's 4 vestibular nuclei on each side. You have a medial, lateral, superior, inferior, medial, and lateral vestibular nuclei. Okay, the cell bodies for this just happen to be in that medial vestibular nuclei. It descends in the medial longitudinal fasciculus, which eventually becomes the medial vestibulospinal tract. Those terms, though, are used interchangeably as well. So some textbooks will refer to the whole thing from start to finish as the medial vestibulospinal tract. Some will refer to the whole thing from start to finish as the medial longitudinal fasciculus. We're going to talk about as the starting as the medial longitudinal fasciculus, then turning into the medial vestibulospinal tract once it gets into the spinal cord. Okay? Because that's the most common way it's referred to. So here it is. The vestibular nuclei, the medial vestibular nucleus is mainly in the pons. So this is a cross section through the lower part or upper part of the medulla. So this is the upper part of the medulla right here, and this is the medial vestibular nucleus. The medial vestibular nucleus sits a little bit in that upper part of the medulla. It goes in, and here's the medial longitudinal fasciculus. It's a little tiny structure there. You're going to keep hearing this medial longitudinal fasciculus because it's used by a lot of other nuclei. It's a pathway within your brainstem that helps coordinate a lot of your vestibular, visual, and neck motions and reflexes together, because we have what's called like a Steadicam system that we have to maintain our eye and our neck muscles, and everything has to be in sync. So if I turn my head one direction, my eyes go the opposite direction if I want to keep them locked on. Or if I want to turn my eyes and head together, everything has to be synced up. And this medial longitudinal fasciculus is used by a lot of the cranial nerve nuclei associated with that to coordinate all that motion. Does that make sense? So it goes down through the MLF. This is the medial lemniscus right here. So it's in the upper medulla. The MLF sits right at the tip of the medial lemniscus. It's a motor tract, so that's a sensory tract. But that's just so when you're trying to find it in a cross section, especially in the medulla, when the medial longitudinal fasciculus is lined up anterior to posterior. When the medial lemniscus is lined up anterior to posterior, right on the tip of it, on the back of it, is going to be the medial longitudinal fasciculus. So here it is again. So this is the medial lemniscus, but there's the medial longitudinal fasciculus. It's sitting right off the tip, posteriorly, just posterior to the medial lemniscus. But then eventually it comes down here, and it terminates. They're showing it terminating ipsilaterally. And it doesn't even go down to the lumbar cord, sorry. It terminates in the upper cervical area and back. But it also has a fair amount of contralateral connections too. It's probably a little more ipsilateral than it is contralateral. You don't need to know that nuance. Again, you're seeing more bilateral connections because it's a postural muscle. You're turning on muscles on both sides of your neck often at the same time. You're not just lifting a limb. You're turning on muscles that have to activate and balance each other right around your cervical spine. That's the medial vestibulospinal tract, yeah.
In the last section, didn't we talk about the spinal lemniscus being the tip of the medial lemniscus?
That's up in the midbrain. Yes, but that's a good clarification, is that up in the midbrain, so like, here's your medial lemniscus right here. As you go up farther, and this is the pons, we're not even in the midbrain, but as you get up in the midbrain, the medial lemniscus kind of does this, and then right off the tip is the spinal lemniscus. But the medial longitudinal fasciculus, it actually goes up into the midbrain because it's going to communicate with some of the superior colliculi and inferior colliculi. This is the medial longitudinal fasciculus right here. So once the medial lemniscus starts orienting in this medial lateral orientation, it moves away from the medial longitudinal fasciculus. So it just kind of turns this way and twists up, and the medial longitudinal fasciculus, it stays pretty much, in this region back towards the back of the brainstem all the way up in these little tiny column there. All I want you to appreciate here is a couple things. All of these right here are the vestibular nuclei as a group. This region right here that we just taught, this is the medial vestibular nucleus. There's a lateral, inferior, superior, but there's 4 nuclei there on each side. Here's the oculomotor nucleus on both sides, the trochlear nucleus. Those are associated with moving your eyes. The abducens nucleus, which is also associated with moving your eyes, right? All I want you to see here is that there's lots of connections between the vestibular system that go down to your spinal cord. There's lots of connections with the vestibular system that go up to communicate with these nuclei associated with eye movement. So these guys that go down this way are going to your neck muscles, medial, lateral, vestibulospinal tract, and some of your upper trunk muscles. These guys are going to your eye muscles, so that when your head starts to change position, you can keep your eyes lined up with your head, but also keep your neck in sync with moving your head and stabilizing your head, also but synced up with your eye movements, so that you don't get a mismatch between your head movement, your eye movement, so you maintain stable images in your eye when you're looking and so forth. That's all I want you to appreciate. But all of these use the medial longitudinal fasciculus. So these pathways, both coming from the vestibular nuclei going up to ocular nuclei, and then these ones going down and coming in here and going down, this is all medial longitudinal fasciculus in the center here of the brainstem to allow communication between those regions. Okay? We are not talking about these ones yet. That's when we get to the vestibular system. We're going to have a whole lecture on the vestibular system, and you'll hear about how the vestibular system communicates with those ocular nuclei associated with eye movement. We're just worried about the ones that go to your trunk and neck muscles right now. They're descending to go down to your trunk and neck muscles. Now the lateral vestibulospinal tract, it starts a little higher up in the pons. And if we go here, you'll see here's the lateral vestibular nucleus. This is the medial down here. So the lateral, which is right up here, it's a little bit more towards into the pons, just that lower part of the pons. So here it is up here. It's just this region back here in the lower part of the pons, in the back part of the pons. What does it do? It facilitates anti-gravity muscles of ipsilateral extremities and inhibits non-anti-gravity muscles. So the lateral vestibulospinal tract goes a little more laterally in your body too. It tends to promote extension, anti-gravity extension of your limbs but still more proximally, but still a little more lateral. The medial is just more your upper back and neck. This one goes to your limbs and actually to some of the proximal muscles of your scapula, your hips, and so forth, to facilitate anti-gravity muscles and inhibit anti-gravity, inhibit non-anti-gravity. It inhibits flexors and tends to facilitate extensors. Okay, remember I said most of the medial activating system as a group tends to bias towards extension. Here's one of the reasons: the lateral vestibulospinal tract biases your extensor muscles. Okay. It descends in the lateral vestibular. It starts in the lateral vestibular nuclei, descends in the lateral vestibulospinal tract, which you really can't identify in the brainstem. You'll see how it just shows it kind of going down through the tegmentum, this just middle region of the brainstem, and even in here, you can't really, like on a cross section, identify that tract. It's a very small tract, and just moving down through the tegmentum in the vestibulospinal tract. And then it terminates. This one tends to be more ipsilateral in nature, ipsilaterally in the upper and lower extremities of anti-gravity muscles. More proximal, big muscles of the shoulder, hips, and trunk. That's the lateral vestibulospinal tract. And again, it's connected to your vestibular system. It helps to just keep your body upright against gravity, and also change, you help extend your body when you do things like there's a thing they do with pediatrics where they'll take kids and they'll lay them over a ball, and they'll kind of have them, if the kid has got a floppy trunk, they've got like low tone, and they're kind of a flexor, kind of floppy baby, they'll put them over a ball or on a scooter, and they'll like grab their legs and they'll push them forward really fast. Because they want them, they try to stimulate this lateral vestibulospinal tract, because your head, first of all, your head is against gravity. It senses that your head is down, your vestibular system, and then it senses this rapid acceleration forward, and that stimulates the lateral vestibulospinal tract to extend your head and your proximal muscles to try to resist that, because your body knows something's bad, something's happening quickly. My face could get scraped up on the floor here, and you're trying to generate some extension of that kid's body through stimulating those lateral vestibulospinal tracts. Make sense? You can do it with adults too. But you got to have a big ball and you got to be strong enough to do that. I don't typically do that, but I've seen people do that. The tectospinal tract, which your book doesn't mention, the one book, Lundy-Ekman, doesn't mention this tract. Your other one does, but it is also, it's considered some people consider it one of the reticulospinal tracts, even though it's really not in the reticular. It's pretty close to the reticular formation, but the reticular formation is this whole region kind of in the middle of your brain stem here, so it's close to the reticular formation. But the name helps you with this, tecto. Tectum. Remember the back part of the midbrain? The tectum. When you look at the back part of the midbrain, it has those superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi, the corpora quadrigemina. But when we look at it in a sagittal section, it's called the roof of the midbrain. We call it the tectum of the midbrain. This is starting in the tectum. So it's associated with those colliculi somehow. This happens to mediate reflective movements of the head and neck to visual stimuli. So you've got these cell bodies lying in the superior colliculus. The superior colliculus is associated with vision. So when vision comes in to go to your brain and brainstem, part of that visual information goes right to your brainstem and goes to that superior colliculus, stimulates these tectospinal tracts to make you go boom and move your head and look towards that visual stimulus. That's moderated or mediated by this tectospinal tract, is what makes you look towards moving objects and orients your head towards that. Okay? So it begins in the superior colliculus. This one's a contralateral pathway. It crosses right here in what's called the dorsal tegmental decussation of the midbrain. So this whole region here is the tegmentum. It's kind of crossing more towards the back part of the tegmentum. If you extend the tegmentum a little farther, it's the dorsal tegmentum, because on this side you have these guys that are crossing over here. I'm just mentioning it. You don't need to know that for the test. It's not even that critical you know this thing crosses over, because it's not a motor tract. it's very unusual to see just unilateral deficits of this. It's very uncommon to have a stroke or something that individually damages one of these little colliculi back here. But anyway, so crosses over, goes down as the tectospinal tract, and just goes to the cervical spine. Okay, it's only in the cervical spine because it's just moving your head, just your head, okay, to that visual stimulus. This is the last one, I think, of the last one of the medial activating pathways. The pontine medial reticulospinal tract. So the pontine reticulospinal tract starts in the pons, right? So here it is in green. Pontine reticular. Starts in the pontine reticular formation. That's just this middle part here. This is the fourth ventricle. The cerebellum sitting off the back here. That's all I want you to see there. This is the basilar part of the pons, the front part of the pons. But what it does is it activates ipsilateral lower motor neurons of postural muscles and limb extensors. Postural extensors. It tends to bias postural extension. That's all you really got to know about the function of this thing. The other thing you want to know about this is that there are certain pathways in your brainstem that tend to work normally whether there's any influence from higher cerebral centers or not. This one tends to function pretty normally with minimal input from the cortex. Some of the other ones require some normal cortical input to keep them under control, not let them go haywire. This one doesn't. This one functions pretty normally without any little descending projections from the cortex to say, hey, this is how you're supposed to act. It can kind of act by itself without doing crazy things. Begins in the pontine reticular formation, descends in the pontine or medial reticulospinal tract. It terminates in ipsilateral motor neurons of postural muscle limb extensors. So it's more ipsilateral than not. Tends to stay on the same side. So medial activating system tends to bias extension, tends to work proximal muscles. It's very unusual to see damage to just one side. Most of these are brainstem tracts, and so if you have brainstem damage that's damaging these, those lesions often extend to both sides of the brainstem, or you've got a lot of other problems you're worried about if you have a brainstem lesion that you're not worried about the motor system. So the important to know about this is, let's say I have a person with a big stroke up in the cerebral cortex affecting the right side of their brain. The left side of the body, especially the distal muscles, will be weak and hard to move. But the proximal muscles, because of the medial activating system, you won't see as profound deficits side to side. They might have a little more weakness on that left side of the trunk, but it's not this profound. It's because the trunk muscles are being innervated by lower centers. There'll be some changes in tone and things like that that are associated with this lesion up here that influence how those act, but you're not going to see like flaccidity of the trunk on one side. It's not as typical because if you have a lesion up here in your cerebral cortex, because you have a lot of overlap too. These medial activating pathways tend to have a lot more bilateral connections. So you just don't see the profound weakness. You have a little more weakness on one side of the trunk, but it's not as profound. And you have a lot of overlap of these, and their basic function just to set the tone and posture. So you don't see deficits in selective motor control. That's the big picture with those. Break time. Any questions? Let's take 5 minutes. So the lateral activating pathways, there's 3 of them we're going to talk about. These are descending from both the cerebral cortex. 2 of them are from one's from the cerebral cortex. 2 are still from the brainstem. Okay, but these tend to synapse on motor neurons that are more lateral and posterior. They tend to bias flexors muscles and more distal control, more voluntary distal control. At least the lateral corticospinal tract, the one we think of as the one that you've probably learned previously, is the one that drives that voluntary distal control, more biased towards flexors. Fractionation of movement, the ability to go, I want to wiggle just this part of my finger. I want to move just my ankle and nothing else. I want to move just that toe. That's the pathway, primarily the lateral corticospinal tract, that does that. where the medial activating pathways are just gross movement, bilateral movement. So the ones we're talking about here from your picture, right there, the lateral cortical spinal tract is this one, and then the rubrospinal is right next to it. The rubrospinal ends, though, in the upper thoracic region. Doesn't go all the way down to your legs. This is primarily you're going to your upper body. But you can see they're actually kind of, there's a little bit of overlap between those two pathways in the cervical spine, lateral cortical spinal tract. And then this one here, this is the medullary reticulospinal tract, but it's also the medullary, it's also known as the lateral reticulospinal tract, medullary or lateral reticulospinal tract. So kind of sits a little more lateral out here with these guys. So that's your lateral activating system out here, and then this is more of your medial activating system here. And you can just see how these pathways are closer to this more lateral part of the ventral horn, and these guys are more closer to those flexor type motor neuron pools also, where they're going to synapse with. So the lateral cortical spinal tract, this is the big one. This is the one that's most important for you to know the details of, and this is the voluntary control, fractionated movement, the ability to individually move muscles out of synergy, So after a stroke patient has a big stroke up in their brain, they can't move just one finger, but they can do this, because these are the medial activating pathways that just move your limb like this, that like move the big muscles of your shoulder girdle and move in synergistic motion. So it's the lateral activating system that allows you to go, I just want to move my elbow. I just want to move my wrist. I just want to, stick this one finger out. That's the lateral activating system that does that. It begins in area. It starts in the cortex. It runs right along with the medial cortical spinal tract. They all start together. If they start in the cortex, they're all starting together in that Brodmann's areas 4 and 6, the primary motor area and the supplementary and premotor areas. They descend just like the medial cortical spinal tract, corona radiata, posterior limb of the internal capsule, the crus cerebri, the ventral pons, into the pyramids. But here, the lateral cortical spinal tract, different from the ventral or anterior spinal cord, is all of their fibers cross to the opposite side in the lower medulla at the pyramidal decussation. About 85%, so of these fibers, about 85% cross over. The remaining 15% here stay as your medial or anterior cortical spinal tract. They terminate on motor neurons or interneurons in the ventral horn to supply distal muscles. About 55% of your axons from the lateral cortical spinal tract are going to go to upper extremity anterior horn cells, 20% to the trunk, and 25% to the lower body. So you can see a large percentage, 55% of those axons in that lateral cortical spinal tract are going to your upper body, because that's where the fine fractionated movement is most critical. And again, that's why poor OTs, when you damage that lateral cortical spinal tract, you get a larger impact oftentimes on the upper extremity. Not only because of the area of blood supply, the most common place to get a stroke is in the middle cerebral artery, which tends to supply the homunculus that goes to your arm, but just the pure fact that there's so many more fibers there. If you damage the lateral cortical spinal tract anywhere along in the brainstem or anywhere or in the internal capsule, a big percentage of those fibers are going to the upper extremity. So there's just more likelihood you're going to have problems with your upper extremity when you damage this thing. So that's the lateral cortical spinal tract. Now the medullary reticulospinal tract, which again your Ekman book does not, it just calls it, it just lumps it under this big category called reticulospinal tracts. This one here, even though it starts in the brainstem, it's part of your lateral activating system. What it does, it plays a role, its function is regulation of tone. It actually tends to be more inhibitory than facilitatory. It helps to facilitate flexors and inhibit the extensors. So it plays a role of actually inhibiting extensors. So most of your medial activating pathways, right, are extensor biased. Extensor, keep you upright against gravity. Well, this particular brainstem pathway this medullary reticulospinal tract is a little bit of a balancer to those mainly extensor bias pathways. It tends to be a little bit of a counterbalance. It tends to heighten flexor activity and inhibit extensor activity to act as a little bit of a balance. But it's somewhat unique in that actually when you're actually walking, its function is reversed. When it knows you're actually up and walking, it tends to facilitate the extensors and inhibit the flexors because it helps you, assist you with walking. Okay? This particular pathway starts in the medulla. It's so medullary, so that tells you it starts in the medulla, and it's in the reticular formation. But it happens to start in this region right here. This is the medullary reticular formation. This region that it's in, there's a name for it called the nucleus gigantocellularis. You don't have to necessarily know that, but that's that. If you ever see that terminology, that's just the starting point of this medullary reticulospinal tract. There are people that write books this thick and do their life work on just the reticulospinal tracts. So this gets complicated, and we're not going to need to go that, but there's people that spend their entire career and life just studying reticulospinal tracts in primates and all that fun stuff. So this descends both ipsilaterally, bilaterally, depends who you read. Just know that since it's a brainstem tract, it just tends to be more, it's not so clear cut that it's one side or the other. It just tends to, let's think of it more bilaterally in nature. And it goes to motor neurons of postural muscles and limb extensors. It's very crude in the where it just goes to lots of muscles and tends to inhibit those extensors when you're not walking and excite flexors. So it helps, that's why it's part of the lateral activating system most of the time. It acts more like it helps flexors and inhibits extensors, which is what your lateral activating system is wanting to do. Like when you're bringing and doing skilled movement, you tend to want to not have your extensors just keeping you from doing that. You have to have balance between flexors, and this helps balance. It helps with the postural muscles, balancing them out a little bit so they're not always fully extensor biased. Then the rubrospinal tract, last pathway. Rubro is red, and so it starts in the red nucleus. And you all know, right, that the red nucleus is in the midbrain, or you do now. So here's the red nucleus. It's neat because you can actually see it in an actual cross-section with your naked eye. You can see this little red nucleus. And starts here in the midbrain. And this is all still part of the tegmentum of the midbrain. It's in the tegmentum, but it's in the red nucleus. It crosses over pretty immediately to the other side. This is a contralateral pathway, so it's going to cross over and go to the other side. It is closely associated with the lateral cortical spinal tract. It joins kind of up with the lateral. Once you get in the spinal cord, it joins up with the lateral cortical spinal tract. You know, your lateral cortical spinal tract is running down through the front part of your pons and brainstem, but once you get to the spinal cord, that rubrospinal tract goes over and joins it. Okay. It crosses, and this crossing point is called the ventral tegmental decussation of the midbrain. This is the ventral. It's kind of more in the front. And it's a tegmental decussation. It's a crossing point in the tegmentum in the front part of the midbrain. Not that critical from a clinical standpoint for you guys to know that. It's more critical to know that the rubrospinal tract really is contralateral, and so is the lateral cortical spinal tract. Those are the two that are the most contralateral and purely contralateral pathways of all the pathways we've talked about so far. They descend in the tegmentum of the pons and medulla, so they just descend in the middle of the pons and medulla. There's not a distinct tract there to see. Then once it gets to the spinal cord, it joins up with the lateral cortical spinal tract. It terminates on motor neurons or interneurons of the ventral horn to supply various muscle groups with an emphasis that the majority of their connections are with upper extremity flexors. The rubrospinal tract is a midbrain tract that helps the lateral cortical spinal tract in the upper body to help facilitate flexors, to balance out, again, the medial cortical spinal tracts that tend to bias extensors. So it says, hey, I need to do a flexor activity right now. My lateral cortical spinal tract is sending signals to my hand, my foot, my elbow to flex. Rubrospinal tract, help me out with this. And actually, the rubrospinal tract is much more developed in primates that climb things, that climb trees. And so when you're climbing, if you're a climbing animal, the rubrospinal tract is kind of helps kick in and help with the climbing process where you're flexing those arms to help pull yourself up and so forth. So it's not as strong, and its function is less known in humans than monkeys. So of what it's, you know, maybe a leftover kind of remnant kind of thing, evolutionary speaking wise, and it's become less important in us because we're not climbing all the time. Here's another critical feature, is in order for the rubrospinal tract to function properly, it requires normal cortical input. So when your cortex is sending signals down and your lateral cortical spinal tract, it has collaterals that go to the red nucleus to say, hey, this is how you're supposed to be acting right now, and this is maintaining a certain level of activity in that I want you to help me some, but not too much. I want you to help me flex this arm, but don't help me too much. Because what happens in a stroke patient, okay, left-sided stroke, lateral cortical spinal tract is damaged from here. Some of the offshoots of that lateral cortical spinal tract that are going to my red nucleus are no longer working as well. So now the red nucleus is actually no longer being dampened to its appropriate level, and the red nucleus gets overactive, and it helps me too much. It creates too much flexor activity in my upper body. And so a person with a stroke, they often carry their arm like this because their rubrospinal tract is overactive. You want it active, but not too active. And your normal input from normal higher centers when everything's working right keeps the red nucleus at this right level of activity. When you get damage to the lateral cortical spinal tract and the cerebral cortex, the red nucleus says, we don't got anybody to tell us what to do. We're just going to go crazy with upper extremity flexion. And then your medial cortical spinal tracts go crazy with extension of the trunk and lower body. And so when somebody with a stroke of a big stroke up in the cerebral cortex damages that, you've got the rubrospinal tract being kind of given free rein, and it creates upper extremity flexion. The rest of the medial cortical spinal tracts as a whole, when they're left to their own devices, make you extend, including your leg. And so you get this. When you tell a person to walk with a stroke, their leg can't bend and their arm can't straighten. And they're walking with all this like extension in the leg. They can't flex their knee and hip. And they do one of these. This is called a spastic gait, hemiparetic spastic gait. And their arm is like this. And you tell them to move their arm, and then you go, lift your arm up over your head. And they go, like this. All they can do is flex it more, because that's all rubrospinal and primitive pathways doing that, because they can't do this because the lateral cortical, they can't do this because the lateral cortical spinal tract isn't intact to allow them to balance all that out. Does that make sense? So now we got to talk about, so that's all this stuff we talked about so far is to the trunk, body, and limbs. We also got to talk about the face and head and one of our neck muscles. These are collectively referred to as the cortical bulbar tracts. The bulb is your brainstem. That's what they used to refer to it as the bulbar system of the bulb is your brainstem. That's why they're called cortical bulbar tracts. So this is motor pathways going from your cortex to the cranial nerve nuclei that move muscles in your face, eyes, tongue, neck, okay? So that's all those you have voluntary control of your eyes. You can choose to move your eyes. That's the voluntary part of that. The tectospinal tract is the involuntary, where your eyes divert, but you have voluntary control. I can stick my tongue in and out and move it around voluntarily. That's the voluntary part of that, but my tongue works also for speech and for swallowing, kind of involuntary, but these are the voluntary pathways. I can open and close my mouth voluntarily, all those things. That's what we're talking about here. These are driven by the cortical bulbar tracts. All of these are contralateral. Just like your lateral cortical spinal tract, they're contralateral. And they run with your lateral cortical spinal tract up in the cerebrum. They're just coming from a different region of your homunculus here. So this is neck, face, tongue. But your body and everything up here, all of these guys join up together. They all go down through that corona radiata, internal capsule, crus cerebri, front of the pons. But then with the cranial nerve nuclei, or the cortical bulbar tracts, they just end at the appropriate cranial nerve nucleus associated with the facial nerve, the oculomotor nerve. Some of them go down to actually your upper cervical spine, to cranial nerve number 11 for spinal accessory nerve, for moving just that upper part of your trap, and SCM. So that's all they do, and they all cross over. So they're all contralateral. So if I have a stroke on the left side of my brain, I'm going to have trouble with, if the stroke is big enough, and if it's like, say it's an internal capsule, and it affects both my body and all those cortical bulbar. So lateral cortical spinal tract and cortical bulbar tracts. They are really close together in that internal capsule. If I damage all those, I'm going to have the whole side of my face weak, paralyzed, the whole body, limbs paralyzed. But I still may be able to sit them up on the edge of the bed, and they can hold their trunk up because those medial cortical spinal tracts are still functioning somewhat. They might have some gross movement of their shoulder and upper limb because of the medial cortical spinal tracts. They might be able to move their hip and leg a little bit, but it's mostly paralyzed, depending on how big the lesion is and so forth. So that's the cortical bulbar tracts, and we're going to do a whole lecture on cranial nerves. You'll get to see these connections more specifically. But for now, that's all you got to know about. They're contralateral, and they're voluntary motor pathways that go to the cranial nerves that drive face, head, trunk, not face, head, neck, and tongue movement. Then we have some non-specific activating pathways. So these are pathways that influence motor output, but not specifically. They're not going to specific muscles or specific regions, and you can't define them or see them in cross sections, but they're called the cerebrospinal and raphe-spinal tracts. And we talked about the cerebrospinal and raphe-spinal tracts. They play a role also in descending pain control. Remember, we talked about these are some of the descending that end up on the dorsal horn to modulate pain. Well, they also end up in the anterior horn to modulate motor output. Okay, they have general effects of motor performance and motivation. So here's an example of a non-specific activating issue. You guys ever heard of, like, when somebody chokes or has the yips when they can't perform under pressure? Because they just, that's me. I can't. That's why I can't play golf or sports that require, like, where there's actually time to think about it, because it'll mess me up. And so that's the cerebro and raphe-spinal tracts. Your limbic system actually has some influence over these cerebro and raphe-spinal tracts. And what happens is that you get up over that putt. Oh crap! This is $1 million putt, And some people can just, so what? I won't change the way I approach this putt at all. My limbic system goes overactive, tells my cerebro and raphe-spinal tracts, oh crap, this really matters, you suck, you freaking out, you're never going to make this putt. It sends general signals down to those levels of my spinal cord. It increases motor output, but more than I need it to, and it ends up causing where I might get co-contraction of muscles of both sides of my trunk and my limbs, and I want to have a nice smooth stroke that I've done before, but it changes it for that brief moment because I get over facilitation of those pathways. And that's where it takes, like, practice, putting yourself in those situations so you can turn off that limbic system that's telling that cerebro and raphe-spinal tract to get overactive and cause you to have, tighten up, tighten up and get stiff and not move fluidly and start thinking about it too much, literally. So that's what but they also can be helpful. There's times you want to be alert and ready and, like, poised, and it kind of turns up your nervous system appropriately, but they can get in the way. So it's a matter of they can be useful or they can get in the way of things. So it's trying to manage those with practice and putting yourself in situations that simulate stress or in different situations. Motor areas of the cortex, we've mentioned these. So there's a primary motor area, that's area number 4. That's the movement, execution, and fractionation. When you're actually sending discrete signals to discrete muscles and motor units to get that fractionated movement, that comes from that primary motor area. Brodmann's area number 4. Supplementary motor area, these are motor planning areas. This is area number 6, which is just in front of the premotor but superior, okay? This is especially active prior to doing bimanual tasks or tasks that require a specific sequence of movements. This is where you store little mini programs for tasks you do all the time that require, like buttoning my shirt. It would be a bimanual task that's repetitive in nature, and before I get ready to button a shirt, that supplementary motor area would be very active in signaling the initial signals to get that process going. And it requires a sequence and so forth. Premotor area, just below that, is a little more involved when you have to generate patterns of movements involving multiple joints and muscle groups, especially things that are a little faster in nature, but like, generating a golf swing, generating a throw or something like that. These are those little programs are stored more in that premotor area, especially if it's unilateral in nature and you're just using one hand to do that activity. But though that's kind of simplifying it, that those are active before most movements unless it's a truly reactive movement. Like if you've done a movement before enough times, you're going to have some of that information stored in those premotor and supplementary motor areas. And there's overlap in the function of these a little bit. But if it's a truly novel movement you've never practiced before, never experienced before, then it is primarily a primary motor area thing, also influenced by your cerebellum as you're making errors along the way to make adjustments to that until you've done it enough times that your premotor area and supplementary can kind of take that new reference movement and store it. Okay, so you can access it quickly and not have to think about it. It becomes more automatic in nature then. So these are the areas in the brain we showed you already. So area number 4, primary motor strip, supplementary motor, premotor. And then this motor planning area for speech, production of speech, motor planning for your tongue and everything to store, like to get out the right words, those kind of things, which we haven't talked about yet. Oh, cool, we're done. Awesome. We got done at least even a couple minutes